I recognize the leader of the third party.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Ça me fait plaisir de lever en chambre to provide a response to the government's budget as the leader of the third party in our Legislative Assembly, and certainly it's an honor and privilege to respond to the budget as a representative of the people of Fredericton South in this chamber. Mr. Speaker, $9.6 billion is what government intends to spend in the next year to serve the people of our province. Despite $165 million in additional revenue over what was received this past year, this budget is designed to drive our deficit back up to $180 million by spending $235 million more than last year. Do the math. After 3 years of effort, Mr. Speaker, to balance the books, this budget just continues to add to our ever-growing debt. Government has got to start living within its means while helping the tens of thousands of New Brunswickers who lack the means to live. This can be done. We can do both, but government is doing neither. I believe the $165 million in additional revenue is more than enough to support new initiatives that are needed to make life better for New Brunswick, Mr. Speaker. After steadily reducing the deficit of $500 million inherited from the former government by 22% in 2015, cutting it 32% in 2016, cutting it 54% in 2017, government stalled out this year, with the deficit barely decreasing from the $119 million in 2017 to $111 million this year. And now, with this budget, Mr. Speaker, government intends to drive the deficit back up by 64%. We don't need to go to bankers from away, Mr. Speaker, to get a view on what's going on here. The Auditor General, our own Auditor General, Mr. Speaker, wrote in her most recent report that she was encouraged by the recent signs of fiscal progress and hoped this progress continues. Clearly, it has not, as this budget spends more than it takes in for the 11th consecutive year. Moreover, the Auditor General noted that the net debt has doubled in a decade and said this growth in debt is unsustainable. She says that continued action is required because steadily increasing debt, and this is very important, and I quote, steadily increasing debt may eventually impact the province's ability to meet its existing financial obligations, both in respect of its service commitments to the public and financial commitments to creditors, employees, and others. So, Mr. Speaker, once again, as she has done year after year, she's called on the province to set and achieve targets for long-term net debt control and reduction. And once again, Mr. Speaker, her recommendation has been ignored in this budget, inexplicably. It's time that we take the Auditor General's recommendation to heart. This doesn't require austerity, as some would have you believe. Some services actually have already been cut to the bone and need to be built back up. What it requires, Mr. Speaker, is different choices in the way the more than $9 billion is spent every year in New Brunswick. For example, Mr. Speaker, on top of the $150 to $200 million of financial help to industry that once again is contained in this budget, the Minister announced an additional $50 million. We can't continue to afford to subsidize huge, profitable multinational corporations, yet this is what government continues to do. Le gouvernement doit remplir deux rôles principaux, protéger et habiliter les citoyens et leurs collectivités. Ces responsabilités doivent donc se concrétiser dans le budget. The budget should be focused like a laser beam on making life better for people, particularly for those who struggle with poverty, their health, their finances, or their age. Comment le mieux affecter ces dépenses pour garantir que nos enfants réalisent leur plein potentiel, pour garantir que nos aînés reçoivent les soutiens dont ils ont besoin pour vivre leur plein potentiel? Comment affecter ces dépenses pour garantir que nos citoyens et leurs collectivités puissent s'adapter dans un monde en rapide mutation? How do we allocate these expenditures to ensure our communities are vibrant, more self-reliant, and resilient? How do we allocate these expenditures to help New Brunswick make the transition to a low-carbon economy that necessarily must be powered and fueled with green, clean, renewable energy? How do we allocate these expenditures to move down the path to reconciliation with First Nations in New Brunswick? The Minister of Finance says the budget is designed to address three challenges: senior care and health care, youth employment, and the economy. To me, Mr. Speaker, it's startling that poverty did not make the cut. The Conference Board of Canada study that the Premier likes to quote that ranked New Brunswick as having a high quality of life in Canada also pointed out that we're being held back from the high rates of poverty in our province. We know that poverty is a huge factor in the poor health of our population, in the high literacy rates, and in unemployment. Yet, Mr. Speaker, the budget does not tackle poverty head on. That's what we need to do. That's what we would do. Yes, the national program to establish affordable early learning centres across Canada will be very helpful. In 2006, 71% of single mums with a preschooler was living in poverty in New Brunswick. An incredible statistic. So I applaud, Mr. Speaker, I applaud the federal government for this national initiative that all provinces are implementing to ensure that early learning and affordable child care is available to Canadians and to New Brunswickers. And I trust in New Brunswick it will be implemented effectively. However, I fear this government is more intent, at least at this point, on scoring political points from this national initiative than rolling it out in the most effective manner possible. I hope I'm wrong. Mr. Speaker, one of the most effective ways to cut health care costs, improve literacy, increase employment, and propel community development is in fact by tackling poverty. Yet, once again, income assistance rates remain frozen at levels, Mr. Speaker, that are impossible to live on. This effectively sentences individuals and families to government-enforced poverty, with single people trying to live on $537 a month. After you pay your rent, Mr. Speaker, there's precious little left to cover the cost of food and other essentials of life. And on top of that, there's all of these rules that keep people living in poverty, keep people from getting ahead. Whether it's the prohibition against sharing an apartment to make their money go a little farther, or the clawback of child support from single mothers, Mr. Speaker, or disability pensions that are clawed back from the disabled who are on income assistance, or the royalty revenue for Indigenous people who are living off reserve and our income assistance. Unlike Prince Edward Island and New Brunswick, there is nothing here in this budget to pilot a basic income guarantee, which could make a real difference to the lives of people living in poverty. There's no mention of accelerating the increase in minimum wage, Mr. Speaker, which would help the working poor. There is no agency set up to fight poverty other than the Economic and Social Inclusion Corporation, which once again had its budget frozen in this budget. The budget for adult training has been cut. In light of this, Mr. Speaker, it's no wonder that overcoming poverty wasn't identified as a key priority in this budget speech. Les listes d'attente pour les logements subventionnés demeurent longues et les budgets pour le logement n'ont guère évolué depuis l'an dernier à 92 millions de dollars. Pour ceux qui sont sans logement, malgré le travail remarquable des organisations communautaires de Fredericton, Moncton et Saint-Jean, nous restons sans engagement pour le financement des stratégies d'abord chez soi dans nos collectivités. The Canadian government announced its $40 billion national housing strategy last November, but there seems to be no sense of urgency whatsoever to finalize the Canada-New Brunswick agreement to gain access to New Brunswick's share of these funds, to provide affordable housing, and to fight homelessness in our province. The most common request for help in my constituency office, Mr. Speaker, is from people who are in insecure housing, unsafe housing, who have been recently evicted, are looking for housing, or are homeless. I've come to the conclusion that, in fact, the responsibility for housing needs to be reorganized so that NB Housing, once again, Mr. Speaker, reassumes its leadership role and its mandate to ensure affordable housing is available to New Brunswickers in need. Mr. Speaker, I think it worked far better when NB Housing actually was an operating agency and not just a legal entity. The biggest part of this budget, Mr. Speaker, a quarter of the spending goes to health care. So I think it bears some attention to speak to this. And I want to speak to how we could spend the dollars differently to reduce health care costs and improve access to health care overall, Mr. Speaker. Because it is about how the money is spent. Choices are made. And so it's a question of where that money is spent and for what purposes. So the health budget is $2.8 billion. Most of this money, Mr. Speaker, 80% pays for hospitals, physicians, and drugs to care for people after they fall ill. So it amounts to sick care for an unhealthy population, Mr. Speaker. So we'll see in this budget $1.3 billion spent on hospitals, $665 million spent on doctors, $200 million spent on drugs, and $113 million spent on mental health care. Now, Mr. Speaker, a smart budget would allocate its expenditures to reduce the number of people falling ill in the first place. I don't see this in the budget because it means two things: a clear focus to combat poverty and real action on prevention and health promotion. It actually means a third thing: how we deliver health care. A smart budget would deliver health care differently to improve both access and deliver that health care in a less costly manner based on the community-based delivery model that we should be pursuing. And that's what we would do, Mr. Speaker, because we look upstream for solutions rather than applying Band-Aid solutions. The conditions into which people are born, grow, live, work, and age largely determine whether someone falls ill or develops chronic diseases. Even the vast majority of cancers, Mr. Speaker, and we seem to have a cancer epidemic in this province, are caused by environmental conditions, from diet, from alcohol addiction, from poor air quality, poor food quality, all those conditions within which we live and grow, Mr. Speaker. A livable income, a secure roof over your head, sufficient and healthy food, a sense of belonging and education in a healthy home, workplace, and environment will vastly improve the health of our population, which will dramatically cut the costs of health care, or sick care as it really is. Cela répond au besoin de mettre en place des politiques et des programmes publics plus efficaces pour le développement social, le développement communautaire, la santé et la sécurité au travail et la protection environnementale. Dans un budget pour le bien-être, on s'attendrait à trouver un emphase important sur la prévention et la promotion de la santé, mais ce domaine demeure sous-financé à moins de $7 million. To take one example, Mr. Speaker, the Department of Health has estimated that alcohol abuse and addictions in New Brunswick costs the provincial government every year, at least in 2002 when these estimates were made, $448 million. So this is, many years ago, and it was almost $500 million in direct costs to the government of New Brunswick. Think of the savings. Of that amount, $120 million were health care costs directly. So these numbers are 15 years old, but just imagine the savings to the health care budget alone if we were able to cut alcohol addiction in this province in half, Mr. Speaker. This budget doesn't address this or other similar examples I could present. The one area, in fact, of spending that traditionally has been designed to prevent disease and foster health promotion is public health. And inexplicably, the budget of the Chief Medical Officer of Health was cut by almost 30%, with large numbers of her staff being scattered among other departments. Green initiatives to make our province more self-sufficient in healthy food, beginning with our hospitals and nursing homes, to cut alcohol addiction, to get cancer-causing pollutants out of our workplaces, our homes and neighborhoods would in fact dramatically cut healthcare costs because we would have a far healthier population. But it requires making important choices. A second essential pathway to lower healthcare costs and a healthier population is improving and changing the access to healthcare services, Mr. Speaker. Our health system remains designed to address acute problems anchored in our network of hospitals, with doctors serving as the sole gateway to health services, making for very expensive health care, Mr. Speaker, for chronic conditions and for minor ailments, and in fact inaccessible health care, that is mental health care, for many. Nous dépensons 1,3 milliard de dollars pour nos hôpitaux où nos aînés sont obligés de s'installer, faute d'appui aux soins à domicile ou aux espaces dans les maisons de retraite qui coûtent beaucoup moins cher. Les personnes avec des conditions chroniques et souffrant d'affections mineures et celles qui n'ont pas de fournisseurs de soins primaires sont obligées d'utiliser les services d'urgence à l'hôpital alors qu'il n'y a aucune urgence. This government, just like the government before it, talks about the priority and benefits of community-based health care. It can deliver a significant portion of the health care now delivered in hospitals more effectively at less cost in ways that are better suited to managing chronic diseases, treating minor ailments, prevention and health promotion, which is why this government and the former government talked a lot about it. However, the action has not been forthcoming. The network of community health centres promised by both the Tories and Liberals has never materialized. Places like Petitcodiac are ready and waiting and in real need of a community health centre, but nothing has happened. No network of community health centres means continuing expensive health care. The government's promise to improve access to health care by maximising the use of health professionals, such as nurse practitioners, pharmacists and midwives working to their full scope of practice, has been broken, Mr. Speaker. These health professionals are often in a better position to deliver health care services more effectively and at a lower cost. So I would have thought implementing this election promise would have been a priority from day one, Mr. Speaker. But it was not. Pharmacists can handle a treatment of many minor ailments and issue prescriptions more affordably. But unlike just about every other province, these services are not covered by Medicare in New Brunswick. This leaves people sitting in ERs for endless hours, waiting to use the expensive machinery of the hospital to get a prescription for common infections, rather than simply popping into their local pharmacy for a few minutes, sitting in the emergency ward for hours upon hours with a painful urinary tract infection, when a few minutes in a pharmacy, Mr. Speaker, could help solve the problem. With the positive deal just announced to bring down the cost of generic drugs in Canada, there in fact is also an economic imperative for our pharmacists to be able to deliver, work to their full scope of practice, to deliver health services, in fact, covered by Medicare, as their revenue will drop from those prescriptions. So this could help make up the difference. Other provinces recognize it, Mr. Speaker. We need to recognize it. The revenue would help offset these losses from Medicare, ensuring that no community loses their pharmacy while improving access to health care. How can we lose? Nurse practitioners could also become primary care providers for so many who've been waiting for years for a family doctor at a lower cost than physicians, but this government will not permit them to establish private practices and be reimbursed by Medicare. So what's happening, Mr. Speaker? Well, as a result, we have nurse practitioners leaving the province for work. We have nurse practitioners losing their licenses because they cannot get the minimum hours of work they need to keep up their certification. Mr. Speaker, this is appalling. Another health professional, Mr. Speaker, midwives can provide pre- and postnatal care and deliver babies at a much lower cost than obstetricians, freeing our obstetricians to concentrate on high-risk pregnancies, which unfortunately there are far too many. The postnatal care that midwives can provide can ensure that children get off to a good start in life. Yet in 3.5 years, Mr. Speaker, only 3 midwives have been permitted to practice in New Brunswick, and only in a single location, which happens to be Fredericton. Mr. Speaker, this is the government's 4th budget which it has failed to implement these advances, all of which were promised in this government's election platform, all of which could make a real contribution to the biggest expenditure in this budget and every budget, and that is health care. Instead, we have communities who may lose their only pharmacy, thousands of people without primary health care providers when nurse practitioners are out of work, leaving the province, families wondering why they can't access a midwife in their community, and communities wondering if they will ever see a community health centre. So, Mr. Speaker, this is how money gets spent differently. More affordably, better access to health care, better health care, and a lower overall budget. This year, Mr. Speaker, New Brunswick will receive $5.2 million out of the $250 million available from the Canadian government under the Canada-New Brunswick Agreement on home care and mental health care. This national program is intended to improve access to mental health care for all Canadians, particularly for youth. Yet in the budget, Mr. Speaker, I see only a $2.5 million increase in the mental health care budget. Comment ces fonds seront-ils dépensés? Seront-ils utilisés pour étendre l'accès aux services de santé mentale communautaire, ciblant les enfants et les jeunes, reconnaissant l'efficacité d'interventions précoces pour traiter les maladies mentales? Est-ce qu'ils seront utilisés spécifiquement pour financer la psychotherapy? Bonne question. The discussion of healthcare costs continues to be caught on the rocks of a very politicized debate on the number of hospitals we should have, which just exploits the fears of people that they will lose access to healthcare as a result of future efforts to control healthcare costs based on cutting hospitals, Mr. Speaker. Greens believe we can improve access to health care at lower cost by moving more health care into communities, delivered by a wider array of health professionals working to their full scope of practice. Nurse practitioners, pharmacists, midwives, psychotherapists must all play a prominent role in our healthcare system in our communities. Cela rendrait les soins de santé plus abordables et plus efficaces. The Premier has repeatedly insisted, in fact, that our aging population represents the province's largest challenge. Yet this budget barely scratches the surface for seniors, Mr. Speaker. It's been almost 4 years since the former government released a 3-year Home First strategy designed to keep seniors in their home as long as possible. And that, Mr. Speaker, was based on the recommendations made by the Premier's panel on seniors in 2012, 6 years ago. When this government came into power, they talked a lot about Home First, but we've seen very little action, and repeatedly emphasized its commitments to Home First. But in fact, the Home First strategy, which was 3 years, has now expired, and we've barely gotten to first base. So, Mr. Speaker, this is the first budget where we're seeing a little bit of action, but not sufficient action. Les soins à domicile sont en plein déroute. On marque gravement des maintien à domicile tellement ces travailleurs sont mal payés. C'est bon de voir que ce budget pose les premiers jalons pour s'attaquer à ce problème urgent. Government received, in fact, $12.4 million for this fiscal year from another national program of the federal government under the Canada-New Brunswick Home Care and Mental Health Agreement to increase home care by supporting caregivers. This federal money was key to making progress in this budget. It provides $11.3 million to support family caregivers, and we see $12 million to increase the wages of home support workers as well as special care home employees. The budget also will finance a small secretariat within the Seniors and Long-Term Care branch at Social Development to put some capacity to do strategic planning and develop public policy and programs for seniors, Mr. Speaker. The capacity that was stripped out of the department and most departments years ago, which is one of the reasons government seems so rudderless so often. All positive steps, though, Mr. Speaker, in the right direction, but a long time coming and less than comprehensive. In the aging strategy, Mr. Speaker, the government highlights the need to recognize age-friendly communities, but it does not appear that this budget provides funding to help municipalities upgrade their infrastructure to actually become age-friendly, as has been done by Nova Scotia with its age-friendly community grant program. Mr. Speaker, older seniors also often don't drive or are unable to drive and need access to public transportation. And in fact, Mr. Speaker, in a timely way, the government received the recommendations for a public transportation strategy from its own New Brunswick Economic and Social Inclusion Corporation last year. That would help support seniors living at home by providing them access to convenient, affordable transportation. And in fact, a key recommendation of that report was for dedicated provincial funding to expand transit and community transportation. And another was to provide stable core funding to allow community transportation initiatives to focus on service delivery to seniors and all New Brunswickers. Je ne vois aucun de ces éléments dans le budget. On ne peut pas retirer les services locaux aux communautés sans fournir les moyens aux gens pour qu'ils puissent accéder à ces services-là où ils ont été centralisés. I see $3 million in revenue from the federal government from its public transit infrastructure fund, down from the $6.5 million received last year. But this fund is for infrastructure, Mr. Speaker, not operational costs, as has been recommended in the transportation strategy that was submitted to the government last year. Dans son discours, la ministre a dit qu'il fallait créer des possibilités pour permettre aux jeunes de rester ici et que le budget comprenait des mesures pour y parvenir. Eh bien, Monsieur le Président, rétablir le programme de rabais sur les droits de scolarité pour les nouveaux diplômes contribuerait grandement à l'atteinte de cet objectif. A new report, in fact, from the Maritime Commission on Higher Education, just out, found that the decline in the retention of New Brunswick University students with the class of 2012, Mr. Speaker, had been reversed for the class of 2014, with 74% of New Brunswick University graduates residing in the province 2 years after graduation, Mr. Speaker. So the tuition tax rebate was working. The government said at the time when they got rid of it there was no evidence. Well, Mr. Speaker, here's the evidence to bring it back. So bring it back. It was well established that at the time it undoubtedly had a positive impact, and here's the evidence. It represents, Mr. Speaker, the tuition rebate represents an expenditure of $25 million in the budget, but it is a true investment in helping graduates get a good start in life here in New Brunswick. Repurposing some of the $150 million dedicated to business could readily fund a renewed tuition rebate fund and help keep our New Brunswick graduates at home. The third priority, Mr. Speaker, in this budget that the Finance Minister spoke to was the economy. The Minister of Finance said in her speech that building an innovative and productive economy is important. Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. However, Mr. Speaker, the way this government's budget intends to address this is by throwing millions more at efforts to increase exports, for example. Yet, we are already, as the Minister points out, one of the most export-dependent provinces in Canada. To me, that would suggest we've got a bit of a problem, that we shouldn't be so export-dependent, because that means we're dependent on the volatile markets outside New Brunswick for the health of our economy. So you would think, Mr. Speaker, that the budget instead would contain some initiatives to make us, in fact, less export-dependent, to grow our domestic economy, Mr. Speaker, to increase in a relative way the size of our domestic economy versus the export-based part of our economy. But there's nothing in here for that, Mr. Speaker. It's time we try that. It's something new. And it's time to try something new. It's time to focus government economic policy on, in fact, replacing imports, growing our local production of goods and services as a basis of our prosperity. C'est intéressant. Une étude qui sera bientôt publiée par le Centre for Local Prosperity de Nouvelle-Écosse s'est penchée sur les avantages pour notre économie de remplacer des importations coûteuses par des produits locaux pour stimuler la prospérité, Monsieur le Président. The results of their study demonstrates that targeting just a 10% increase in local production to replace imported goods and services across the region could add more than 43,000 jobs. It could add $2.6 billion in new wages and $219 million in new tax revenue, Mr. Speaker. This is not based on the growth of exports, Mr. Speaker. This is based on reducing imports by growing the local production of goods and services to replace those imports, Mr. Speaker, which in New Brunswick amount to more than $9 billion worth of goods. So imagine the local economic benefits of replacing even a portion of these imports with local production and local services, Mr. Speaker. This is the kind of economic development that Greens will pursue. L'année dernière, le gouvernement a lancé une stratégie visant à transformer notre économie pour qu'elle soit beaucoup moins dépendante des combustibles fossiles. But, Mr. Speaker, I see little in this budget that would achieve that transformation or even lay the groundwork for that transformation. An import replacement strategy, in fact, Mr. Speaker, is absolutely consistent with that transformation from an economy and society largely dependent on oil, gas, natural gas, and gasoline and coal in ways that will both strengthen our local economies and achieve the goals of the government's climate action plan to actually transition the province to what they're calling a low-carbon economy. Mr. Speaker, to replace the imports of oil, coal, and natural gas, we need to increase local services to upgrade the energy efficiency of homes and buildings. This will grow the demand for energy efficiency products and technologies, more of which we can produce locally. We will need to increase the local production of clean, renewable energy, which will grow the demand for these fuels, technologies, and the associated infrastructures and services, more of which we could be producing locally. Shortening our supply lines through replacing imported food by increasing the production and consumption of local food will reduce the carbon footprint of transportation while growing our local economies. Repairing equipment and machinery like electrical transformers, as they do in Sackville, rather than importing new replacements from outside the province, is another example of how local services can replace imports, bringing the work to New Brunswick while helping to meet our legislated targets to reduce carbon pollution. The success of the craft brewing industry in New Brunswick is an example of how replacing imports from outside our borders by increasing production locally has multiple economic benefits. Local food, local manufacturing, locally produced green, clean energy will do the same, Mr. Speaker. It's interesting, Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotia has only half the exports of New Brunswick, yet it has less debt per capita than New Brunswick. And, Mr. Speaker, it has balanced its books. Import replacement is an economic strategy that Greens will pursue to make our communities more prosperous and stable. It's an economic strategy, Mr. Speaker, that will focus on Main Street, not Bay Street. This is unlike the $150 million that Opportunities New Brunswick and the Regional Development Corporation draw from this budget, which helps big, profitable business enterprises at the expense of our local businesses. Greens would change the emphasis to ensure that Main Street, in fact, is thriving. Mr. Speaker, Bay Street is quite capable of taking care of itself. If a hardware store, or hairstylist, pharmacy, restaurant, farmer, building contractor, or energy contractor, to name a few, are looking to expand their businesses, they should be eligible for payroll rebates. These businesses are the backbone of every local economy in New Brunswick, and are an essential part, in fact, of the green economy because they have a very small environmental footprint. Last year, this government gave $3.6 million in payroll rebates to the highly profitable Bell Align Canada, and a forgivable loan of $6.8 million to the phantasmagorically profitable TD Bank. A bank! We gave money to a big bank, Mr. Speaker. When a hardware store trying to expand, looking for a little help to cover the payroll for a couple of years of a few new employees, is ineligible. It's shameful, Mr. Speaker. And that $6.8 million was on top of the $2 million previously provided in payroll rebates to the TD Bank, because the $6.8 million is a forgivable loan, which is essentially a grant. So, Mr. Speaker, that sucking sound we hear in the province of New Brunswick is the sound of our local wealth being hoovered by these super corps. Mr. Speaker, government can live within its means while ensuring all have the means to live. But it takes a new approach. You can't keep doing the same thing and expect a different outcome. We need a new approach that's rooted in the realities of today and the hopes of tomorrow, not the experience of yesterday. Our economy is no longer, and certainly is no longer, and will no longer grow like it used to in the past, Mr. Speaker. So we have to do new things. It's time to jettison old strategies that no longer work and adopt those that will. And you know what, Mr. Speaker? It's time to mobilize the energy, the knowledge, and the creativity found in our communities to help move New Brunswick forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Merci beaucoup.